Hello everyone, and welcome to the Refugee Studies Centre. My name's Catherine Briddick, and I am delighted to be introducing today's speaker, Professor Fareda Banda. Professor Banda holds law degrees from the University of Zimbabwe and the University of Oxford. She's currently at the University of London School of African and Oriental Studies. Fareda's career and interests include and span legal reform, legal activism, and of course, legal scholarship. On reform, Professor Banda has worked at the Law Commission of England and Wales and advised the government of Namibia on law reform, drafting a law reform plan. On activism, Fareda has and continues to work with a huge number of civil society organisations. She's been a trustee of Womankind Worldwide and Forward and has contributed to the work of Equality Now and the African Commission. On scholarship, Professor Banda has published widely and teaches on women's rights, family law, religion, and migration. In this seminar, Fareda will be talking about her new book, which approaches migration through the prism of law and literature. In the book, Fareda draws on novels, poems, short stories, literary realism, and human rights law to explore the experiences of African migrants and asylum seekers. She's going to talk today for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions and discussion. As always, you can use the chat box to pose questions at any time through the seminar and afterwards. So, speaking on African migration, human rights and literature, please welcome Professor Fareda Banda.
Thank you very much, Catherine, and thank you very much to you and to the Refugee Studies Centre for hosting me, and to everybody who's come this evening. And particular thanks to Annalise and to Leah, who helped to set all this up. I'm really grateful. It's an odd thing to be doing, to be speaking about migration and literature, because I'm neither a refugee lawyer, nor am I actually a literary scholar. But I came to writing the book purely by accident, because I read so many novels that I gave up reading law articles and reviews, and I had to kind of justify what I'd been doing for the past few years. And I came to decide that maybe a book may be the way forward. And what inspired the book were several things, but I suppose the three that I want to share with you are media reports that I either heard or read. And the first was in 2014, I started writing the book much later, but I remember this. It was the first sinking of a ship in Lampedusa. And there was a report in The Guardian about a ship. The ship went down and an Italian diver went down to retrieve some of the bodies. And he came up with the body of a woman, and attached to her was her baby son, and the umbilical cord was still attached to his mother. And many years later, when I read Naira Wahid's poem, Lands, I thought of that, because at the time as a lawyer, my response had been about nationality state. They'd moved from Eritrea and were seeking asylum when the ship was sinking. And I remember thinking, after I read Naira Wahid's poem, Lands, where she says, my mother was my first country, the first place that I ever lived. And I thought, well, at least this child was within his mother's country. He was with her, she was his country. And I remember thinking that was quite moving. And then there was another report, and this time it was a World Service broadcast that I listened to. And this was about a man who fell to earth, and it turned out his name, or his mother's name for him, was Zuzu. And he was a Mozambican migrant who'd worked in South Africa for a while, had a Swiss employer who'd moved back to Switzerland, and she promised to send him some money to get a visa. And actually she had, but his money had been taken away from him by some crooks at the embassy in Maputo. And so he moved on to Angola, and he'd managed to get airside in Luanda, and he'd basically stored under the wheels of a British Airways flight. And he fell out just as the landing was the landing gear came down in Twickenham, London, which is not quite down the road, but near where I live, in kind of 40 minutes or so. And again, another Naira Wahid poem struck me, which was Immigrant. You broke the ocean in half to be here, only to find nothing or no one that wants you. And I kept wondering about this. And then the final newspaper report was actually in a London newspaper, the Evening Standard, and it was written by a woman whose son had traveled to France on a school trip on a coach. I think they went to see where the Normandy landings had happened. And on arrival back into this country, they discovered a young boy who had stowed underneath the bus. And this was another thing that struck me. So the children who had passports and the right to travel were on the bus, and the child that didn't was underneath the bus. And this set me thinking about this idea about human rights and who has them, because we say that human rights inhere in all of us by virtue of our humanity. And yet clearly these cases are telling us that people have to resort to such desperate measures to travel that clearly these human rights to freedom of movement, for example, cannot be enjoyed or are not being enjoyed by everybody. And so that also set me thinking about, well, given that my empathy and insight had been provoked not so much by the law articles that I had read, but by the vast literature that I had been reading on migration, perhaps it was time for me to engage with this question of, can literature help us to understand or to better understand human rights? And this is part of a framework called artivism. And it's something that Molefe Asante has spoken about, art as activism. And so this was the starting off point for me. So what I thought I'd do this evening is to give you a sense of the overview, to give you an oversight of the book, just the architecture, and to talk through some of the themes that emerged as I was writing it. And so starting with this idea of artivism or art activism seems to manifest in many, many ways. So I've spoken to you about the poetry of Naira Waheed in her book Salt, which I recommend to you. But there's also photography. And so the art activism that has most triggered public sympathy has been, for example, the Napalm Girl in the Vietnamese conflict, Alan Kurdi more recently, the young child who was killed with her father, the El Salvadorians who were crossing the river. And so there was something about these photographs that seemed to trigger the need to say or do something. But the question is, while the photographs evince sympathy, is that sufficient? And I think there was something that made me as a human rights and also as a third world person think, which is, why does it take such graphic suffering for us to be able to kind of feel empathy? The other thing that I looked at the time was National Geographic from 2018 in April. And this National Geographic was focused on race. And in it, the editorial, the National Geographic apologized for the way that they had represented Black and minority ethnic people in northern societies, but also indigenous people and Black majority people, including on the African continent and obviously minorities here. And so this representation made me think about the way that stereotypes operate and are reinforced, and the role of media in the reinforcement of that stereotyping. And I think one sees that in the way that photographs are used about the way that migrants are presented sometimes. The other thing that I was interested in looking at was music. So that's one of the things I talk about in the chapter on art activism. And I grew up in Zimbabwe, Southern Rhodesia, initially during apartheid until we got independence. And I remember that the year that we were getting independence, I was a very young teenager, just made it into teenagers, and Bob Marley came to sing. And he has an album called Zimbabwe. And so he had this wonderful album called Zimbabwe, and we all celebrated. And it was Bob Marley's kind of radicalism that spoke to many of us. And helped us to kind of articulate the struggle. And so I remembered that quite clearly. And then there were also other ways of thinking about activism, including the work of Wole Soyinka and his plays and how they challenged the Nigerian governments when they were not necessarily engaging in a fair way. And I thought the other thing that was very interesting is the use of biography and autobiography. And specifically, one of the things I wanted to explore was the difference in the reception or the perception of two people who at the time belonged to the same family, so the Mandelas. So when you read Nelson Mandela's biography, when you read autobiography, and also when you read biographies of Mandela, he's always presented in very positive light, Whereas when you read biographies, except with one that I used on Winnie Mandela, there is this idea of her being a violator of human rights. And I wondered about this, the presentation, the narratives. That's the other thing that I wanted to explore, the narratives that were told about men, about women. And so there was a kind of misogyny sometimes, I think, in the way that Winnie Mandela was written about. So all these things were important to me in terms of thinking through, some of the themes and also the points of analysis. The second chapter that I looked at, I moved into, was migration histories. And here I was interested in exploring two things. One was this historical amnesia that seems to have presented itself in Western societies, where there is a denial of the presence or the history that links us. But also that I wanted to explore what Mazrui calls the impact of the diasporas of colonialism and the diasporas of slavery on Western societies. And so in terms of the histories, I started off with Power's book, with Fryer's book, Staying Power, where he says, Africans were in Britain before the English came. Africans were in Britain before the English came. And so he uses, as per Olusoga, everything from archaeology and also all, the fact that now we can identify, Roman Britain included Africans. And of course, there was the Empress Septimia Severus. I also looked at Kaufman's book on the Black Tudors, and everybody knows about John Blank, but I was more interested in an African woman, a negra, near Bristol. And I loved her because she was a self-made woman. She had one cow and she milked her cow. And so that's what she lived on. But more than that, I wanted to explore what happened post-colonialism. And I did this through the prism of case law. And the cases that I looked at included, the first one was on the treatment by Britain of the Mau Mau. And as some of you know, it has been found in Foreign Office records that there was torture of the Mau Mau by the British personnel who were in Kenya. And so a claim for damages was brought to the United Kingdom. And initially Britain said, well, it's bygones, it's over, until Desmond Tutu said, well, it's important for us to behave not only legally, but also morally. So it was interesting for me that there is this denial of a link in terms of culpability and the need to make right that which has gone past. And the second case I looked at was the East African Asians, which was about the expulsion or the forced leaving of East Asians from, of African Asians from Kenya, Uganda, and how they were received here, which was with enormous resistance. And the lawyer who represented them, Anthony Lester, actually gave a lecture subsequently in which he identified that there was great resistance to giving them any rights. And the fact was that the government changed the law, the Commonwealth Immigrants Act in 1968, to try to prevent colored, quote unquote, to use the language of the time, colored immigration. And so the reason this is important in terms of thinking about this historical amnesia and its impact on human rights is because Nyerere had said in the 60s that Black Africans should not fear going to England, should not feel bad about it because they were returning to the motherland, to the colonial, to the empire motherland. And yet when the children came and said, mother, we are here, they were told, no, you don't belong to us. So again, they had to bring a legal case, and this went as far as the European system. And the third and more contemporary case that I looked at was to show actually that these violations are ongoing. And that was the Chagos case, the Chagos Islanders case. And this is the reverse, because so far we've had cases about either people who want compensation or people who want to come to live here as citizens, as promised by the imperial exercise. But these are the Chagossians who said, we'd like to go home, please. You took our home away from us and we are very keen to go home. And excuses have been given about why they couldn't go home. And again, what has been interesting for me, what was interesting for me to explore in that instance is you can't come in, but you can't go out either. And so there seems to be two sets, a bifurcation of rights, the enjoyment of rights for people like us. And what seems to me to come clearly through is that people like us are not brown or black bodies. So all the cases that I've spoken about, the Mau Mau case, the East Asian case, the Chagosian case, are people being sacrificed, in the case of the Chagosians, for American military bases. And so when we talk about human rights, when we talk about entitlements to equality, to dignity, to right to family, all of those things, one is left wondering, do they not apply to Black and brown bodies? And I thought that was important to explore. So in terms of the current movement, one of the things that I also looked at in the second chapter was this idea of pass the parcel. Pass the parcel is this idea of either burden sharing or what we're seeing on the borders at the moment, which is nobody wants to take responsibility when people are asking to move. And it seemed to me, again, another violation of what the rhetoric of European promise is. And so the rhetoric of European promise is of tolerance, of equality, of fairness, of giving refuge when people need it. But the practice was radically different. And again, we explore some case law there. And so that struck me as very interesting, partially because you know this in terms of refugee studies. Most of the refugees and IDPs are held within the regions from which they come. So it's not as if Europe is being asked to bear a disproportionate burden in any way. So that struck me as very interesting. And this moved me into the third chapter, which was about how people get to move, because one of the things that I think has become increasingly clear, and if one of the things you could do is, I'm sure you've looked at it, but there's something called the Henley Passport Index. There's something called the Henley Passport Index. And that is a way you can check or how your passport ranks. And so in terms of checking how your passport ranks, for example, you can see how many countries you can travel to with visas or without visas. So I looked at my own country today, Zimbabwe, and it turns out I can only travel to 65 destinations without a visa, and over 160 require visas. And I looked at the countries to which I could travel without a visa, and there were none, and I say none, that were European, that attached to North America. I will speak plainly, there were no white countries that I could travel to, no white majority countries that I could travel to without a visa. All the countries that allowed me to travel without a visa are within the African continent, maybe 4 in Latin America, and not many, outside of that. And that struck me as really interesting, because if people are not allowed to travel, and this is something that Denher says, if nobody is allowed to travel out of Africa without a visa, and the refugee regime has been so narrowed in its construction, then how else are people supposed to move but for the exercise of what I call self-help? And so I explored the ways that people try to move, and this includes through the literature, and this was interesting. So the literature takes great pleasure, and it was tons of fun reading the stories, the narrative stories, the fictional stories about the schemes that people try. And so there are tourist visas, student visas, marriage visas, and obviously investment visas. So most of the people who can get a visa may apply as a tourist. The funniest ones in terms of the literature were the marriage visas. And so there's a wonderful novel by Mbue, a Cameroonian American woman, where she says, well, you can marry a woman from, Minnesota who's 90, as long as the immigration doesn't think that you're there to you're only trying to get her for her green card or for her passport. And so there's this running narrative about what evasive action can you take in terms of trying to avoid contact so that you can access a visa. And because it's so difficult to access visas, physically difficult to access visas, either you have to go to a different country to your own country because your country doesn't necessarily have the embassy or the staff that issue visas, or your visa application is sent outside. It means that people don't actually have a way to move. And so this opens up an alternative to freedom of movement, and that is the use of smugglers. So those of you who've read Kasravi, his book Illegal, will know that he asks the question, what is the distinction between a smuggler who tries to get somebody from point A to point B, and a refugee lawyer or somebody else who takes over. Now, you would say that they're different smugglers, and I think this is right, and I think it's important that we don't kind of say all smuggling is good. But he makes a distinction between the person who helps you cross the border, you know, the herdsman who helps you cross the border because he knows where the places, or she knows where the places are that you can get across. And I suppose the point that is being made is, if life is made so difficult by not having any legal options of travel, then is it any surprise that people are then forced to engage in what I call extra legal avenues? And so the law has always focused on what the state sees as law. The law has always focused on what the state sees as law. But as an African, I was taught that there's law everywhere. So they're plural normative forms, they're plural normative orders. So one of the things I wanted to explore using an article by Mnookin and Kornhauser, and it's called Bargaining in the Shadow of the Law. Bargaining in the Shadow of the Law. And the article is 1979 Yale Law Review. And it's actually an article about divorce. And it's about the work that divorce lawyers do in terms of negotiating for and on behalf of their clients. And so what they say is each client has what they call a set of bargaining endowments, a set of bargaining endowments. It's a bit like counters or smarties that you're playing trading with. And so when you have these bargaining endowments, you also have the shadow of the law. So that's why it's called bargaining in the shadow of the law. So in your negotiation, you are negotiating on the understanding that if you do not actually get to agreement or compromise, or just to decide what it is that you're both going to get, the law will intervene. So the law casts a shadow. And so what that means in practice is often people with young children, the young children will be given to the mother because there's often a maternal preference rule. And so often men in heteronormative heterosexual relationships will not push as hard for custody of young children because they perceive that they have fewer bargaining counters. So now you may be wondering, what has this got to do with refugee law or with freedom of movement? Well, it's got a lot. I use this thesis to say, well, it is precisely because people from the global South have so few bargaining counters that they cannot actually, the law either doesn't see them cast a shadow or is so oppressive that they are forced to circumvent the law. And so the circumvention of the law leads to you to have plural normative orders, because the fact that the state law is not engaged does not actually mean, or not engaged actively by the participant. The state is very interested in where you are. But what that means is you are then forced into another legal system. And this legal system could be the smuggler's legal system. And so the smuggler operates on rules. The smuggler operates on rules, and the rules are fairly clear. You pay me X and I will get you to point Y. It's going to cost you this much, and the sanction is, if you don't pay, this will happen to your family. So it's actually a recognizable legal order. I'm not endorsing this. I'm not saying it's a good thing. But what we're finding is, for people from the global South, the absence of option forces them into oppressive alternative legal regimes. And until and unless we recognize that, then I think we will be missing a huge part of the human rights picture. If we're only thinking about violations of human rights as something that the state does to you, then actually we're missing a big point. Another theme that I wanted to explore in the book, and I think I explored in the book, is this issue of intersectionality, which is another big theoretical framework that everybody's keen on. And so the intersections I was interested in exploring, both in chapter 2 and then in this chapter 3, which was the one on visas, and then moving into part 2, which is a specific breakdown of women, of LGBTIQ, and of children, just to focus on those 3 specific groups, is the prism of intersectionality, thinking about race, class, and gender, race, class, and gender. And so one sees that migration patterns tell us a lot about intersectionality. And so these investment visas that I spoke about, that you can get from a Henley Passport Index, I looked up today when Zimbabwe, apparently that how to improve my passport or how to improve my travel. So one of the ways I can improve my passport or my travel is to apply for one of these investment visas, but I don't have 250,000 pounds kicking about. So the question becomes, who gets to apply for these investment visas? And who gets to apply for the investment visas are largely disproportionately men and disproportionately wealthy people. because you need to invest money to be able, and not just a little bit of money, but minimum 250 depending, to be able to get these. So again, we have another plurality opening up, which is if I'm a woman and I want to move, then the question is, what are my options? And I found, and I use Anne Stewart's thesis here on body work, looking at the ILO figures, looking at the percentage of 42% of women who moved, most of them moved to do what they call body work. And so this was cleaning, caring, and possibly sex work. And the sex work tended to be not only, but largely through trafficking, So this is another kind of narrative that arises, is the denial of state access or freedom of movement forces people into exploitative and harmful legal regimes. And so many women, not all women, many women who ended up in the sex industry or forced to sell sex were trafficked. And this is despite there being trafficking, extensive trafficking regimes that say this is not supposed to happen. The other group of women that I looked at in the second part of the book, in chapter 4, were women who worked as domestic workers, because I said, remember, body work, so sex work, domestic workers. And this introduced its own interesting intersection, which was intra-group discrimination. So discrimination between women, because the people who are largely employing these domestic workers tend to be women, middle-class women who are employing Black and brown body women to come and do their cleaning, caring, including for their children, in exchange for them being able to engage in work outside of the home. And again, I looked at the novel of Leila Slimani, Lullaby, which everybody loved. This is set in Paris, and it's a wonderful conversation, about a North African woman, actually French now North African woman, who's looking for a domestic worker. So she speaks to her friends about a nanny for her children, rather. And she speaks to her friends about, well, how do I go about it? And so she goes to an agency, and the agency books just show women who are Filipina, who are North African themselves, or from anywhere else besides Europe. And in the end, the husband says, well, we can't actually employ somebody who doesn't have papers sans papier to look after our children, because if anything happens to our children and they have an accident, she won't be prepared to take them to the hospital. They're fine to use these people without papers for decorating and for other work. So he's not saying let's not use undocumented labor. He's saying we just can't use undocumented labor to look after our children. There's another interesting thing that comes up in Leila Slimani's book, which is the protagonist says, I'm not really keen on having a North African woman because it would raise too many issues. And the issues it would raise is this would be a North African woman employing another North African woman, and this is just too complicated for her. And I explored an issue of intra-group discrimination between the groups, when I looked at migrant exploitation of fellow migrants or people who have settled. And so it's important to acknowledge that it's not just the state hostile environments that are creating difficulties for people. It is also when people arrive, what happens to them. And so you tend to flock to people like you. And the people like you may be saying, I'm taking a risk in employing you because you don't have the paperwork. Or the people like you may be exploiting you because they are here for a longer time. They're more sophisticated, quote unquote, in terms of knowing how the system works. So I didn't want to run away from the fact that discrimination and exploitation is not only externally imposed, it doesn't only come from the state, it can also happen within these other plural normative orders that are partially salvation in helping you to either maximize whatever limited bargaining counters you have. But I didn't want to get away from that. The other thing, before I forget, that I wanted to be very clear about is I didn't want to excuse African or sending states. So I was very clear that the reason that people are taking such risks with their lives, the ones that I identified in the media reports earlier on, are precisely because of failure of states, the sending states, to deliver socioeconomic and cultural rights, to provide political stability. So this is not about giving passes or excuses to the people who've gone before, to the originating countries. I think these human rights exploitations and violations need to be looked at in the round. The next chapter, I'm nearly done. The next chapter was on LGBTIQ rights. And here I was interested actually in this idea of the Western rhetoric of lecturing Global South states about their need to respect LGBTIQ rights. So one would expect, given the rhetoric, that when people from the LGBTIQ plus community come and seek protection because they're being persecuted, that they would be received with open arms. This is actually, in practice, not what happens. In practice, what happens is credibility is challenged. Can you prove that you're gay? And there is a model of proving that you're gay, which is very Western in context and cultural practice, which is this idea of coming out. Now, if I'm coming from Zimbabwe as a lesbian woman, why would I have photographs, intimate photographs of me with my female partner? Why would I have exchanged intimate text? Why would I have written letters? Why on earth would I have photographs of us, that somehow are asked to prove? And so it is this idea of Western evidence in procedural terms and the skepticism around everybody lies, which seems to be the starting point, that creates a lot of challenges and difficulties, even for the groups that supposedly are supposed to be seen by Western law, are supposed to be protected, including by refugee law. And so again, there's this link in terms, for me, in terms of human rights and hypocrisy. So European claims for, in the book I call it European Enlightenment, or African homophobia meets European Enlightenment, a fairy tale, because in practice it turns out to be a fairy tale. And the last chapter I wanted to explore was children, because I found that children were in a liminal position, they were in between position, and there's been a lot of literature for children, and this is how I came actually to literature myself in terms of refugee migration, was reading to my children The Roman Mysteries, actually by Caroline Lawrence, and also thinking about how many of the children's books are about trying to get them to understand why people come, who they are, people like us, and how we should treat them. We should treat them with kindness. And there I engaged the book of Higginbotham, and this is about the Convention on the Rights of the Child and Human Rights, and using literature and the Convention of Human Rights, or the Children's Rights Convention, 1989 Children's Rights Convention, and the use of literature. And in thinking about the way the children are treated, in refugee law, when they arrive as unaccompanied minors, they're supposed to have all these extra protections, but they are often treated as if they were adults. And there is a wonderful series of books that you should absolutely get called The Refugee Tales, which are produced by different authors for the I think it's Gatwick Detention Center and the Kent Detention Center. And The Refugee Tales is based on Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. And Chaucer's Canterbury Tales was a positive experience of people going on a pilgrimage to Canterbury. The Refugee Tales is about refugees or asylum seekers and how they're treated. And so they're actually based on personal narrative, but they're written as kind of fictional accounts. And there's one on the detention of a 14-year-old, and he is put in adult jail. And so he says, who helped me? It were my fellow detainees. They said, we must get him a lawyer. We must try and help him. And so this idea that you would either treat a 14-year-old as if they were adult, and then you have all these, problematic checks. So we say that we respect and value vulnerability in children. We say we need to protect them, but in practice, we don't actually. And there's a gender dimension to this, which is the girls often, not always, but disproportionately end up again being removed, being trafficked, ending up in sex work. And so there is again another disconnect between our practices, our rhetoric. And the second part of the children's chapter that I wanted to explore is, what is life like here for migrant children? And it was shocking to me to read the accounts of people who have grown here, who have grown up here, either as citizens. Rene Ede Lodge, who tells the story of being the only Black child in a South London school, and the teacher saying, draw your beautiful blue eyes. Well, she clearly didn't have blue eyes. I read Barack Obama's first book, Dreams from My Father, and he talks about moving from Indonesia, where his mother was, to join his grandparents in Hawaii. And they asked him where his father was from. He said Kenya, and it's like, well, does he eat people? And then there's, a South African woman who says, well, when we moved to America, I was constantly asked, do you live in a mud hut? I grew up in a mud hut. I had a great time, but that's hardly the point. And so Ekoash Eshowan also writes in his biography, Black God of the Sun, about how hard it was to grow up being called, quote unquote, a wog and all sorts of other problematic names. And I thought, how hard is it for children here who look or think that they belong because they carry the passport, but actually their experiences make them constantly feel like outsiders within their own countries. So that's the liminality. You're liminal in terms of coming in where you're a child, an unaccompanied minor. The law has certain protections, but in practice, those protections are not met. You're liminal as a citizen child because you're not granted full citizenship, not necessarily by the state, but also the cost of getting citizenship is another thing that I explored. And so I conclude in the last section with two stories on walls by Neren Hadero, who's an Ethiopian lawyer, and she's just won, so it was a short story, so she's just won this year's Kane Prize, but this is the 2019 one when she was shortlisted there, and her wall is about her experience as an Ethiopian migrant who started off in Germany, and then ended up in Iowa, and her family meets a German professor who takes very good care of them. And so every Armistice Day, 11th, November, he takes her to the library and they look at pictures of the Berlin Wall. And he says, when they built the wall in 61, it cast a shadow, but not just on the one side, it cast a shadow on both sides. And so there's this idea that actually when in human rights, I saw it as an analogy of, suffering, both for the one who denies and the one who is denied. And the other story was John Lancaster's The Wall, which was longlisted, I think, for the Booker. And that's a dystopian, novel about an island which is guarded by defenders. And I think this speaks to this idea of Fortress Europe. So there's lots that I wanted to say, and I think I've overrun my time, but thank you very much. And I'm happy to unpick anything anybody would like me to talk about.
Thank you so much for the talk, for sharing your thoughts about the book. We've really enjoyed the past hour. So on behalf of all of the Refugee Studies Centre and the people attending, thank you very much. And we hope to be able to welcome you to Oxford physically very soon indeed. Thank you, everybody, and good evening.